She left before the sun came up. No note, no farewell, not even the small cruelty of a slammed door. She simply gathered the three things she owned that mattered: a cracked compass her father had pressed into her palm the day he stopped calling her daughter, a folded square of cloth that still smelled faintly of her mother's hearth fire, and the short iron blade she'd carried since she was 12. And she walked out of the settlement at Koavath while the rest of the clan still slept off the mead. Her name was Veth. She was 23 years old, half a head taller than any human soldier she'd ever met, built like something that had been argued into existence by two contradictory forces and had reached a compromise. Her tusks were small by Orcish standards. Her mother had always said that was what made her pretty. Her father had said it was what made her soft. Her skin was the color of old iron, her eyes a pale amber that unsettled people who weren't used to orcs looking directly at them. She looked directly at everyone. The settlement at Kovath sat on the edge of what the human cartographers had started calling the Reconciliation Zone, a 30-kilometer strip of reclaimed agricultural land wedged between the old front lines of the Weave War, where orc clans and human townships had been court-ordered into cohabitation by the Unified Council 3 years ago. Nobody had asked the orcs. Nobody had asked the humans either, but the humans had lawyers and the orcs had teeth, and the council had decided that teeth were the kind of argument best neutralized through proximity and shared municipal services. It hadn't worked exactly, but it hadn't collapsed into fire either, which the council considered a success. Veth had been part of it from the beginning, not because she'd volunteered. Her clan's warchief, an old boar named Gorak, had pointed at her during the first joint meeting and said, "She talks like them, she goes." That was that. She'd spent 3 years as a liaison, a translator, a bridge. She'd learned when to smile without showing her tusks. She'd learned which human officials got nervous if she stood too close and which ones got nervous if she didn't. She'd learned to drink weak tea instead of bark beer at meetings, and to write her reports in the rounded script the council preferred rather than the angular glyph marks of her people. She'd been good at it. That was the thing that nobody seemed to understand, or that everyone understood perfectly and had decided was irrelevant. She'd been good at it, and it hadn't mattered. The edge of the settlement gave way to a gravel track, which gave way to a frost-crusted field, which gave way to the dark tree line of the Thorwood. She walked into the trees without looking back. Behind her, a dog in one of the human homesteads barked twice and went quiet. The stars were hard and cold above the canopy. Her breath made brief ghosts in the air. She didn't cry. She'd done her crying 2 nights ago, sitting behind the supply barn with her back against the wall and her knees to her chest, and she'd decided that was enough of that. The thing people misunderstood about the Reconciliation Zone was that it had worked in the small ways. Children had worked first. Children always did. Human kids from the Haverson homestead used to dare each other to run up and touch the fence post nearest the orc quarters. And then one winter the dares had become races, and the races had become actual proximity. And eventually, Veth had looked out the liaison office window one afternoon to see a human girl of about 8 sitting on the fence post itself, eating an apple and chatting with 3 young orclings who were listening to her with the intense focus that children reserve for storytelling. That had made her feel something she didn't have a word for in either language. Adults were slower. Adults had memory. The war had ended 11 years ago, technically. The Weave War, named for the magical field the orc shamans had deployed to disrupt human artillery in the final campaigns, had burned for 6 years and killed somewhere between 400,000 and 700,000 people, depending on whose census you believed and which bodies you counted. The orcs had the numbers if you counted warriors only. The humans had the numbers if you counted everything, which they did, which was one of the reasons the war had ended the way it did. Veth had been 12 when the ceasefire was signed. She remembered her father lifting her onto his shoulders to see the signing ceremony from across the plaza in Koavath, the human delegation in their gray uniforms, The orc elders in their war paint and treaty furs, everyone looking like they were preparing to do something that disgusted them. What she remembered most was her father's hands on her ankles, how steady they were, how certain. He had stopped being certain about her somewhere in the years that followed. Her mother had gone easier than that, not a sharp ending but a long, slow withdrawal, like a tide that keeps going out until you realize the shoreline has changed completely, and what you're standing on isn't the beach you grew up on anymore. The last conversation they'd had that meant anything was 2.5 years ago. Her mother had looked at her across the fire and said, "You've gotten very good at being someone else." Veth had said, "I've gotten good at being useful." Her mother had looked at the fire for a long time. "That's not the same thing," she'd said, and then she'd gone to bed. She was right, that wasn't the same thing. The Thorwood thinned out about 4 kilometers in and opened onto a long ridge of basalt that ran roughly northeast. Veth climbed it in the dark, using the compass more from habit than necessity. She had been in these hills enough times that her feet knew the way without much input from her brain. Below and behind her, the settlement lights were already invisible. Ahead was nothing but dark hills and the smear of the Milky Way, and the distant orange glow that meant the human town of Breck, about 15 kilometers out. She wasn't going to Breck. She wasn't going anywhere specific. That was, she realized, the first honest thing she'd allowed herself in months. The meeting that had ended it, not ended her career exactly, but ended her faith in the architecture of the thing, had been ordinary in its brutality. A council arbitration session over water rights in the lower fields, which had become the third such session in 2 years, which meant nothing had been resolved and both sides were more entrenched than when they'd started. Veth had spent 40 minutes translating between Gorak's delegation and a human agricultural commissioner named Dras, who had the kind of confidence that comes not from competence, but from never having been seriously inconvenienced. Dras had said, at one point, that the Orc clans needed to demonstrate good faith through unilateral concession. Veth had translated this accurately. Gorak had looked at her for a long moment, not at Dras, at her, and said, in Orcish, "Tell the soft-handed man that good faith has a price, and we have paid it in blood already." She had translated this accurately too. And then Dras had said, also looking at Veth rather than at Gorak, "Perhaps the liaison should explain to her people that the council's patience is not infinite." Her people, as if she were a ventriloquist's puppet who had wandered off script, as if the 3 years of 16-hour days and bad tea and sleeping in the supply barn because neither side's housing wanted a liaison officer in it had produced, for Dras, the simple category of Orc ambassador, interchangeable with any other Orc. She had translated it. Her voice had been perfectly level. Gorak had looked at her again, something in his eyes not unkind, just exhausted. He knew what she was doing. He'd known for years. He just didn't know what else to do with her, and neither did she. That night she had found the message from her younger brother, Karath, informing her that their father had taken ill, and that the family had decided to consult the clan's earth shaman rather than the human medical clinic she'd spent 3 months negotiating access to. He had included a line at the end that said, "Father says you would want to know, though he says to tell you that you don't need to come. Though he says to tell you that you don't need to come." She had folded the message and put it in the fire. By dawn she had made it to the high plateau the locals called the Greyback, a stretch of windswept scrub and exposed limestone about 12 kilometers from the settlement. She made a small fire in a stone hollow, heated water in the tin cup she carried, and sat watching the sun come up over the eastern ridgeline. It came up yellow and cold, which was honest at least. She drank her hot water. She'd forgotten to bring actual tea, which was either a failure of planning or a symbolic act. She wasn't sure, and thought about where she was going. The Thorwood thinned east of the Greyback, eventually giving way to the Marin Plain, which was human farming country for about 50 kilometers before it hit the coastal trading ports. North of the plain was the Drathvald, which was clan territory but not her clan's territory, the Grettor clan, who had been neutral during the war and resented everyone equally as a result, which at least had a certain integrity to it. South was the Old Front, still half-ruined, still marked on human maps with the kind of cartographic shame that meant a place had been too unpleasant to clean up quickly. She thought about all of these places. She thought about her mother's face across the fire. She thought about Drass saying, her people, like he was identifying a subspecies. She thought about her father's hands on her ankles, steady, certain. She sat on the grayback until the sun was 2 hours up and the cold had worked its way through her coat properly, and then she opened her compass and checked the needle, and then she closed the compass and put it in her pocket without having made any decision at all, which was itself a kind of decision. She started walking north. She encountered the first patrol on the second day, about 8 kilometers into Grettor territory. 4 soldiers, human, council insignia, the light blue armbands of the Reconciliation Enforcement Division, which everyone in the zone called the Smoothers because their job was technically to smooth over interspecies incidents, and their actual function was to apply pressure to whoever was being inconvenient at the time. They were young. The oldest might have been 25. They had the posture of people who had been trained to project authority, but hadn't yet accumulated enough experience to do it naturally. She had her hands visible before they saw her, because she'd learned a long time ago that an orc in motion with obscured hands created a specific kind of nervous reaction in young soldiers, and nervous reactions in young soldiers with weapons were one of the more predictable routes to disaster. Liaison officer, the oldest one said, reading her arm badge with visible surprise. Koavath. Was, Veth said. He looked at her. Papers. She handed over the transit pass, which was technically still valid, which she had technically not resigned from the liaison office yet because she'd simply left, which meant that by the council's administrative categories she was still a liaison officer, just one who was walking north across Grettor territory at dawn. He read the pass twice. Where are you headed, officer? She said nothing for a moment. The wind off the Drathvald came down the slope and moved through the scrub grass with a sound like breathing. North, she said. He looked at her, she looked back. That's Grettor territory, officer, he said. The transit authorization doesn't cover. I know what it covers, she said. He handed back the pass. There was a calculation happening behind his eyes that she recognized from hundreds of similar moments. The calibration of how much inconvenience this would cause him against how much authority he could actually claim. She was orcish and female and walking alone, and she had valid credentials, and she hadn't done anything wrong, and she was looking at him with the amber eyes that unsettled people who weren't used to being looked at directly. All right, he said, be careful in the Drathvald. Always am, she said and walked past him. She heard the quiet half-discussion behind her as she went, one of the younger soldiers saying something in a low voice, the oldest one saying something back, the conversation dying. She didn't turn around. The Drathvald was old forest, the kind that had been growing long enough that the trees had stopped being individuals and started being a collective decision. The floor was dense and quiet and dark even at midday, the canopy so thick that snow had accumulated on the branches, and the ground beneath was mostly bare. It smelled like iron and pine and something older than either. Veth walked for 3 hours before she heard anything unusual. What she heard was a voice, human, she thought, though the timbre was off in a way she couldn't place immediately, high enough to be a woman's or a young man's. Coming from slightly uphill, about 40 meters to her right, and carrying the quality of someone talking to themselves, which was either perfectly innocent or a sign of someone in a bad enough state that the social inhibition against self-narration had dropped away. She stopped walking. The voice was saying in rough Gret-Tor dialect, not the common tongue, not human speech, but actual Orcish, pronounced with an accent like someone who had learned it from a book and then from living but had done the book part first. Water, water, I know you're here somewhere. Stop hiding from me. Veth turned uphill. The figure she found, crouched beside a frozen stream that wasn't going to yield anything no matter how long one talked to it, was human, broadly, small-framed, dark-haired, wearing a coat that had been adequate for a different climate and was not adequate for this one. Female or close enough. Maybe 30. There was blood on her left hand, dried and dark, from a wound that had been wrapped in cloth and forgotten rather than treated. She looked up when Veth appeared in her peripheral vision, and did not run, which was either brave or too cold to be afraid. The stream is frozen, Veth told her in common tongue. The woman looked at the stream. I know, she said. I was hoping if I talked to it something would happen. Does that usually work? No, the woman said. But I used to know a shaman who swore by it. She looked at Veth properly for the first time. You're from Korvath. Used to be. So we're both lost. Veth looked at her. The woman's eyes were brown and direct and currently struggling with the kind of fatigue that comes after the adrenaline has been running for too long without rest. There was frost on her coat lapel. She was going to have trouble with the cold before nightfall. What are you doing in Gret-Tor territory? Veth said. Walking, the woman said. What are you doing? Walking, Veth said. The woman considered this. Are you going anywhere specific? No. Good, the woman said. I don't think I could follow a specific direction right now. She stood up slowly and stamped her feet. My name is Saya. I'm an ethnographer. I'm writing a monograph on cross-species linguistic drift in post-war contact zones. It's not important right now. Veth said. Former liaison officer, also not important right now. The stream, Saya said, looking at it again. Veth unclipped the small folding tool from her pack, went to the stream, found a thin section, and broke through the ice with 3 precise strikes. Water welled up dark and cold. Saya looked at her. That's very practical, she said. Yes, Veth said. They made camp in the angle of a fallen tree big enough to block the wind from the north. Saya had a tent that was almost adequate and rations that were militarily sensible and a first aid kit that she'd been carrying for self-evident reasons. Veth cleaned the wound on Saya's hand, a long shallow cut from what looked like a rock edge, not deep but dirty, and wrapped it properly. Saya watched her work with the attention of someone cataloging a process. You learned that in the reconciliation zone, Saya said. I learned to be useful, Veth said. Something shifted in Saya's expression. She didn't push on it. That night, with the small camp stove making a dim orange warmth between them, Saya told her the version of why she was here that was mostly true. Her research had been defunded by the Council's Academic Allocation Board, which had decided that ethnographic studies of integrated communities were less useful than infrastructure assessment. Her monograph was half finished. Her colleagues had scattered to better funded projects. She had come north because the Gret-Tor clan had a form of oral tradition that she'd been studying for 2 years, and she wasn't ready to stop, and the official permits had expired, and she hadn't applied to renew them because she was afraid they'd say no. They would have said no, Veth said. I know, Saya said. So you're here illegally. I prefer persistently. The smoothers I passed this morning wouldn't. Saya looked at the stove. Are you going to report me? Veth thought about it. The honest thought, no. She wasn't going to report anyone. She wasn't a liaison officer anymore, or she wouldn't be by the end of the week when her absence would require an administrative response. She was a woman walking north through a forest in a coat that was probably better than Saya's, but not by as much as it should be. No, she said. Saya exhaled. Thank you. Don't thank me. I'm just not doing a thing that's not help. Sometimes not doing a thing is enough, Saya said. Veth looked at the stove. She thought about her mother. She thought about her father's hands. She thought about Gorek's exhausted eyes. She didn't say anything. After a while, Saya fell asleep with the ease of someone who'd been fighting it for hours. Veth sat awake and watched the forest and thought about nothing in particular, or thought about everything at once, which comes to the same thing. The Grettor clan's winter settlement was a 3-day walk into the Drathvald. They arrived at the edge of it in the late afternoon of the 3rd day, the light going gold through the canopy, smoke rising from the longhouse vents. Veth had been here once before, years ago, on an inter-clan diplomatic visit that she now recognized as having been mostly theater, both clans performing neutrality for the council's benefit while privately holding positions that hadn't shifted in a decade. She'd been useful theater, at least. The sentries were young. Most of the clan's senior warriors were south at the trading negotiations, and they recognized the Kovath arm badge and looked confused about what to do with it. Veth removed it and put it in her pocket, which resolved their confusion by creating different confusion. "I'm not here as a liaison," she said, in Grettor dialect, which was close enough to her own that she didn't need the translation reflex. It felt strange, talking directly, without calculating what would land and what would create friction. "I'm here because I need somewhere to stop walking for a while." The older of the sentries, a woman with ceremonial scarring on her forearms and the watchful eyes of someone who has learned to read arriving strangers as a survival skill, studied her for a moment. "And her," she said, inclining her head toward Saya. "She studies language," Veth said. "She's written more of your oral traditions down than anyone. She's also probably the only human in the reconciliation zone who understands what Grettor means when they say a thing one way versus another way." The sentry looked at Saya. Saya, who had been following Veth's dialect exchange with the focused expression of someone transcribing in their head, met the sentry's gaze directly. "Gethver," the sentry said. It was a greeting, but the specific variant, there were 7, that meant, "We see you as you are, not as you come." It was used for people returning after a long absence, and occasionally for strangers who arrived in a way that suggested they had earned directness. Saya's face changed, just slightly. "Gethver," she said back, and her accent was the book-first accent, and the sentry smiled at it the way one smiles at an endearing mistake. They were let through. The clan's keeper of lineages was an ancient Orcish woman named Thurvak, who had been old before the war, and had developed a comprehensive contempt for the war's outcome that she expressed through complete indifference to the political consequences of her opinions. She received them in her quarters, which were dense with the physical archive of her work, carved bone cylinders, hide scrolls, knotted cord records, and listened to Veth explain herself with the patience of someone who had heard all the kinds of explaining there were. When Veth finished, Thurvak said, in old clan dialect that Veth had to concentrate to follow, "You want to know if you belong anywhere." Veth said, "I know I belong somewhere, I don't know where." Thurvak looked at her for a long moment. Her eyes were amber like Veth's but darker with age. "The daughter of Gorheth of Kovath," she said, "I remember your birth." Veth felt something shift under her ribs. "My father doesn't call himself my father anymore." "Your father is afraid," Thurvak said, "which is different from what you've decided it means." She settled back against her carved sitting board. "You spent 3 years being a bridge." "Yes." "Bridges go nowhere themselves," Thurvak said. "They make it possible for others to go." "You confused being useful to others with having a direction." Veth said nothing. The silence sat in the room like something large and patient. "You have her eyes, you know," Thurvak said. "Your father's mother, she was the same. Amber. She was a bridge too in her time. She eventually stopped and built something instead." "Built what?" Veth said. "A school," Thurvak said. "In the border country. This was 40 years before the war. She taught Orc children human script and human children Orcish glyphwork, and eventually the school burned down in a stupid dispute about well access, and she spent 12 years putting it back together. Not the building, the other thing. Veth looked at her hands. I'm not telling you to build a school, Thurvak said. I'm telling you that the thing you are is not wrong, it's just not finished. She stayed at the Gret Tor settlement for 6 weeks. It was not comfortable, not at first. She was Kawavath, which was neutral to suspicious territory. She had a council arm badge in her pocket, even if she wasn't wearing it. She was the kind of useful that makes people uncertain, too many skills in too many languages, which in any community that has survived through wariness reads initially as suspect. But she was also willing to work, which is the most readable quality there is. She helped with the winter provisioning, not in the management role she would have defaulted to a year ago, but in the physical labor, cutting and stacking and carrying, which is the kind of work that has a comprehensible rhythm and a measurable result, and doesn't require negotiating whose feelings are whose. Her hands blistered, then toughened. She ate the winter food, which was heavy and salt-preserved, and nothing like the council-approved mixed diet she'd been living on for 3 years, and her body accepted it like a homecoming. Saya worked alongside her in the days and sat with Thurvak in the evenings, recording the oral genealogies that the old keeper would share in exchange for tea and argument. Saya was good at argument, not the political kind, the intellectual kind, the kind that moves towards something rather than defending a position. Thurvak seemed to find this entertaining. One evening Veth came back from the woodstack to find the two of them in the middle of a debate about whether language was tool or culture or both, with Thurvak insisting it was neither and Saya insisting she was being deliberately provocative, which was making Thurvak smile. Veth sat down on the edge of the debate circle and listened. Language is territory, Thurvak was saying. When two groups share a language, they share what is possible to think. When they don't, they share only what can be demonstrated. Most of what matters to being alive cannot be demonstrated. That's an argument against translation, Saya said. It's an argument against assuming translation is sufficient, Thurvak said. She looked at Veth. You translated for 3 years. Was it sufficient? Veth thought about Dras saying, her people in Gorek's exhausted eyes, and her mother's voice across the fire. No, she said. It was necessary and it wasn't sufficient. Thurvak nodded slowly. Yes, she said, that's the right answer. The message came from Kawavath in the 3rd week. A runner from the clan network, a young male who looked like he'd been moving fast for 2 days, handed her a folded hide with her brother Karath's glyph mark on the seal. Her father was worse. Not dying yet, not yet was doing a lot of work in Karath's careful phrasing, but beyond what the Earth Shaman could manage. The human clinic she'd negotiated access to 3 months ago was apparently still open, still staffed, still there. Karath had not said anything direct about going. He was 21 and had their father's way of saying things sideways. She read the message twice and then sat with it for a while. The night before she'd left Kawavath, she'd burned Karath's previous message without reading past the first line. She was aware of this. She thought about Thurvak saying, your father is afraid, which is different from what you've decided it means. She thought about the reconciliation zone and the water rights arbitration and Dras. She thought about the fence post and the human girl eating an apple. She thought about her father's hands, steady, certain. She thought about how certainty erodes in people who love something they're afraid they'll lose. She knew that feeling from the inside. She folded the message and put it in her coat. She told Saya in the morning. Saya said, I'll come with you part of the way. You're not done with the genealogies, Veth said. The genealogies have been there for 300 years, Saya said. They'll be there next month. She paused. Also, I'd like to see what you do when you go back. I don't know what I'll do when I go back, Veth said. Neither do I, Saya said. That's why I'd like to see it. Thurvak gave them provisions for 5 days and walked them to the edge of the settlement. She clasped Veth's forearm in the old clan grip, which Veth hadn't been offered in 3 years, which meant something that she didn't try to quantify. Your father's mother, Thurvak said. After the school burned down, she stood in the ashes for 1 full day before she moved. Then she went to find the people who would help her rebuild. She looked at Veth. She didn't rebuild the same school. She built a different one, bigger. She let go of Veth's arm. The standing in the ashes is the important part, she said. Don't skip it. The walk south took 4 days. The smoothers on the Gret Tor border stopped them again, different soldiers this time, and looked at Veth's credentials and looked at Saya's expired permit. And Veth said, in the level voice she'd spent 3 years calibrating, she's with me. And the soldier did the calculation and stamped the permit as a courtesy extension without being asked, which meant something had changed, either in how she said it or in how she stood when she said it, or in the fact that she was saying it without the liaison badge on her arm. Probably the last one. There was something clarifying about removing a symbol you'd used for too long as a substitute for the actual thing it represented. They came down out of the Thorwood on the 5th morning into the thin light of the Reconciliation Zone's eastern edge. The settlement at Kovath was visible from the ridge smoke from the longhouses, the geometric regularity of the human homesteads abutting the organic sprawl of the Orc settlement, the narrow road between them that both sides had contributed labor to building, and that neither side used naturally because it was always politically weighted, which road you used, which side you came from. Veth stood on the ridge and looked at it for a long time. Saya stood beside her and didn't say anything, which was one of the things Veth had come to value about her over 6 weeks. She had learned what silence was for. I don't know what I'm going back to, Veth said. You're going back to your father, Saya said. The rest is secondary. He said I didn't need to come. He said to tell you that, Saya said. That's different. Veth looked at the settlement, at the road. She thought about all the things she'd been. The useful one, the bridge, the translator, the liaison who lived in the supply barn because she was too much of one thing for either side to fully claim. She thought about Thurvak's words. The standing in the ashes is the important part. She had been standing in the ashes for 8 weeks, and she had not been idle while she stood. She had been figuring out what shape the new thing would take. There's a school that doesn't exist yet, she said. Saya looked at her. A proper one, not a goodwill gesture for the council's benefit. One that teaches the written languages the way Thurvak explains it, not just the grammar, the territory. What you can think in one that you can't think in the other. What you have to show instead of say. She paused. It would need someone who understands the linguist side of it properly. Saya was quiet for a moment. That would need permits and funding, and the council would want to own it, which would kill it. Probably, Veth said, unless the permit application was written in a way that made it harder to refuse than to grant, and unless someone who understands how the council's approval process works had spent 3 years studying its pressure points. Saya looked at her. And unless an ethnographer who understood the Gret Tor traditions had documented enough of the oral record that Thurvak would agree to let the material be used as curriculum, which would mean the school was in a sense Gret Tor endorsed, which makes it interclan, not council-initiated, which changes the political category. The silence between them was the kind that fills with thinking. You planned this, Saya said. No, Veth said. I'm planning it now, in the last 2 minutes. She paused. But I've been gathering the pieces for 3 years without knowing I was doing it. Saya looked at the settlement, at the road, at the thin smoke above Kovath. All right, she said. She came down the ridge alone. Saya had gone to the human side of the settlement first, to find lodging and rest, and send word to her university contact about a possible collaboration that might give her monograph a second life. They would meet in 2 days. Veth walked the orc side of the road, which she had used without thinking for 3 years, and she noticed that she was using it without thinking and decided not to change it, because it was not about which road you used anymore. Or it was, but in a different way. She was going to have to learn, for the 3rd time in her life, what it meant to be here without translating herself into something that fit the available categories. The first person she saw was a child, one of the Koavath orclings she'd seen at the fence post 3 years ago, who was now approximately 11, and who looked at her with the frank recognition of someone who has been cataloging the adults around them and knows exactly where everyone fits. "You were gone," the child said. "Yes," Veth said. "You came back." "Yes." The child considered this with the unsentimental practicality of children, who understand return as information and don't require explanation for it. "Karath's at the healing house," the child said. "Your father's there too now." "Thank you," Veth said. She walked to the healing house. It was one of the buildings she'd been involved in, not designed. She hadn't been allowed to design things, but consulted on, in the way the council consulted on things, which meant her recommendations had been filtered through a committee and emerged somewhat different on the other side. It was more human in structure than it should have been for a space that would serve primarily orc patients, which she had noted in her recommendations, and which the committee had noted in their notes, and which had not changed anything. She was going to change that eventually. Karath was in the anteroom. He was 21 and looked like her father would have looked at 21 in a world where certainty hadn't been asked to survive too much. He looked up when she came in, and his face did something complicated. "You got my message," he said. "Both of them," she said. He stood up. He was as tall as she was. She hadn't noticed that before. "He said you didn't need to." "I know what he said," Veth said. "I came anyway." Karath looked at her for a moment. His eyes were darker than hers, more like their father's. "He's asking for you," he said. "Has been since yesterday. In that way where he's not going to say it directly." "In that way," Veth agreed. She went in. Her father was lying on a bed that was designed for human patients, and was therefore too short for an orc of his size, which was the kind of systemic failure that announced itself in a dozen ways every day, and which most people had stopped noticing. She had always noticed. She had written about it in every facility's review she'd ever filed. This was one of the things she would fix. He was smaller than she remembered. This was what happened to certainty when it had been asked to survive too much. Not that it disappeared, but that it stopped expanding, that the person who contained it started to contract around it. His eyes found her immediately, and they were her amber, and they were afraid in a way that she recognized because she had the same fear herself, which was the fear of having spent too long being a version of yourself that other people needed and having mislaid the original. She sat down on the edge of the bed. He looked at her. Neither of them said anything. She thought about what Thurvek had said. "Your father is afraid," which is different from what you've decided it means. She reached over and took his hand. It was larger than she remembered, or she had forgotten how large it had felt when she was 12, being carried on his shoulders, with his hands on her ankles, steady, certain. He didn't say anything. She didn't say anything. After a while, he turned his hand over and held hers back. Not the way a father holds a child's hand. The way two people hold each other's hands when they have both been very far away for a very long time and have found their way back to the same place and are not sure yet what it means but are sure that it is real. She stayed. She met with Gorak 2 days later. He received her in the war chief's hall, which was large and cold and decorated with the trophies and standards of the clan's history in a way that was meant to remind visitors of scale and duration. She had sat in this hall 100 times and always translated herself into liaison mode before she crossed the threshold. She didn't do that this time. She walked in as herself, which was something she was still learning the dimensions of, and sat across from Gorak and let him look at her until he was ready to speak. He was older than she remembered, which was strange because she'd seen him 8 weeks ago. But 8 weeks of whatever she had done in the Drathvald had recalibrated her perception in ways she was still taking inventory of. "You left," he said. "Yes." Without a word. "I know." "You came back." "Yes." He studied her. His eyes were the flat calculation of a man who has governed a community through impossible constraints for 20 years, and is therefore very good at reading whether someone in front of him is a cost or a resource. "What are you?" he said, "now?" "Not a liaison," she said, "or not only." She told him about the school. Not all of it, she didn't have all of it yet, but enough. The Grettor dimension, the language as territory framing, the way it might be structured to exist outside the Council's operational ownership while still being legible to the Council's approval process. He listened with the kind of attention he gave to tactical briefings. When she finished, he said, "The Council will try to take it." "Yes," she said, "they take things by owning them. The way you prevent that is to make the thing already owned by so many people that there's no unclaimed portion for them to acquire." He was quiet. "You need Grettor backing," he said. "Thurvak already agreed in principle." "She agreed to you. I need to agree to the structure." "I know," Veth said. "That's why I'm here." "And the human township, Breck. There's a woman named Saya who has relationships there that I don't. She's working that side." Gorak looked at her for a long time. She sat with his looking and didn't calculate. "The water rights," he said finally, "are a separate problem," she said. "This doesn't solve the water rights. But a school that the Grettor clan endorses creates a different kind of conversation with the Council than what we've had for 3 years. Not a better negotiating position exactly. A different room to negotiate in." He turned this over. "You've thought like a commander," he said, "not a translator." "I've had some time to think," she said. He almost smiled. It was the first time she'd seen something close to a smile from him in 3 years. "All right," he said. "Come back tomorrow with the structure written down. I'll have the clan's legal reader go over it." She stood. "Thank you, Warchief." He looked at her with the expression of someone revising a category. "Thank yourself," he said. "You did the work." That evening she went back to the fence post. The light was going long and orange over the fields, and the post was just a post, weathered and unremarkable, with no children sitting on it at this hour. But she stood at it for a while and looked across the line where the Orc settlement ended and the human homesteads began. The line was exactly as visible as it had always been. This was not a story about lines disappearing. Lines didn't disappear. What changed was whether the line was a wall or a border, whether crossing it meant leaving something behind or meant carrying it with you. She thought about all the versions of herself she'd been. The translator who translated too well and forgot what she was saying. The liaison who had made herself so useful to the process that she'd stopped being a person in it. The woman in the supply barn. The woman walking north. The woman standing in ashes, taking inventory. She thought about her father's hand closing over hers. She took the liaison badge out of her pocket and looked at it. The Council's insignia, embossed on cheap metal. She'd worn it for 3 years as an identity, and it was a job title. She put it back in her pocket. Not because it meant nothing, because it was one word and she was all the others. She looked at the fence post in the fading light and thought about a school that didn't exist yet but would. About a hall full of children learning to think in 2 languages, not translating between them but carrying both the way you carry tools, choosing the one that fits the thing you're trying to do, knowing the difference. Knowing also that some things can only be done in one language or the other, and that this is not a problem to be solved but a fact to be understood. The sky was going purple. A dog barked twice in the human homesteads and went quiet. She was not a bridge. She was not a wall. She was a woman who had stood in the ashes long enough to know what shape the new thing would take, and who had the particular kind of stubbornness that had always looked like softness to people who didn't know the difference, and who was ready now to begin. She turned and walked back into the settlement. Not the orc side or the human side. The road between, which was narrow and politically weighted and had been built by the labor of both, which meant it was the most complicated piece of ground in the zone and also, in a sense, the most honest. She walked it home. The school opened 16 months later. It was not grand. It occupied one repurposed storage building on the settlement's middle line, which Veth had negotiated into a jurisdictionally neutral space through a combination of Gorak's formal backing, Thurvak's linguistic authority, Saya's council application, 9 pages of careful language, 2 months of revisions, approved with a committee note that called it a promising pilot program in supplementary education, and a land use agreement that had taken 3 more months and aged everyone involved. The building was larger than the previous one had been, which was nothing. On the first day there were 11 children, 6 orcish, 5 human. They arrived separately, each group with the particular wariness of children whose parents have instructed them to be polite. Veth had put the greeting on the door in both scripts. The common tongue version said welcome. The orcish glyph mark was the word that meant something closer to "you are here now" in full, which didn't translate exactly, which was the point. She watched the 11 children look at the 2 words on the door. She watched them not translate and not need to. She watched one of the human children, a girl, 7 years old, daughter of a homesteader on the east side, point to the orcish mark and say to the orcling beside her, "What does that one mean?" The orcling considered. "It means like, you got here, all of you, not just part." The girl looked at the mark. "Oh," she said then, "that's better than welcome." "Yes," the orcling said. They went in. Veth stood in the doorway and watched them go. Then she took the cracked compass out of her pocket and opened it. The needle turned and settled north, as it always did, which was an orientation, not a destination. She closed the compass and put it away. She had things to teach today. She went in.